welcome to Meet the Candidates. My name's Eric Crump. I'm with the Homewood Flossmoor Chronicle. Today we're talking with Gary Daggett, who's running for the Flossmoor Board of Trustees. Gary emphasized from his experience on the board over the past 4 years some of the things he's learned and brings to the board, especially in terms of listening to residents, to small business owners, and trying to craft solutions that take into account their perspective. He also advocates for more communication between the village and the community. So, welcome, Gary.
Absolutely.
Well, we want to start with the basic question. You've served 4 years. You had to make a decision. Do you want to keep going? And you decided to try to keep serving with the board. So What informed your decision to run again?
Honestly, that decision was made when I ran the first time, that if I made it to the board, I would want to serve as long as I possibly could. And a lot of that came from, my wife and I, in 2010, we were trying to figure out where we wanted to lay down roots with our family. And one of the things that was really important to us was somewhere that was diverse, because we wanted our kids to have a place where they felt like they were represented. So we looked around. There was a couple of options, but really Homewood Flossmoor ended up being the only option for us. So once we got to Flossmoor, absolutely fell in love with the community, and then realized that it wasn't just diverse on paper. Like, you walk around the neighborhood, you go out to eat, you go to the baseball park, and you see it's an active diversity. So immediately we fell in love even more and tried to figure out, okay, we're going to get a lot from this community, so how can we give back? And that's held true. Our family's benefited so much from being here. So whether it was coaching baseball, my wife being on the library board, or running the book fair at Western Avenue, or serving in the various community events that happened, running for trustee was kind of an extension of that. And there was a couple of things that I saw early on that I was like, I don't think my perspective is on the board. And to me, I think a wide range of perspectives is really important. So I still feel like my perspective is important on the board, and that's why I'm here.
Well, I wonder if you could go into a little bit more about the specifics of your perspective and how it adds to the board.
Yeah. So one of the things that's really important to me is communication, and communicating in an empathetic way and also a complete way. And one of the things I saw through a couple of things that had happened through the village, one I believe is around 2017 when we had all of the flooding. There was just a couple incidents where the village had an opportunity to really listen and communicate well, and it didn't happen the way that I would have liked to see it happen. And then there was another incident when it was a kind of a bigger thing with the pickup trucks, which seems small, but there was just a situation with a specific resident who had a need for the pickup truck, and it just seemed like the communication and the willingness that just from some people on the board in the village wasn't great. So that kind of started me thinking, like, maybe I could help. And that's when I started pursuing it, asking questions, learning about the process, going to a couple of board meetings to see what is this about. And that's what kind of pushed me in that direction.
Well, communication is, of course, not easy. It's sometimes messy and difficult. And I know that that's a priority of yours. The board the village has still had some issues with that just in the last year, especially with like the Heather Hill detention basin, with a lot of information out in the community about it, but not all the residents feeling like they got that information or really understood what was going on. And I was wondering if your experience now after 4 years has given you ideas about how to continue to improve the communication loop.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things. First off, I think good communication starts with good listening. And I think having conversations and making sure that we have access to those conversations for the community to where they have the ability to say, hey, here's what is best for us. And there's always going to be people, unfortunately, that slip through the cracks. But when it's enough to where you're like, we missed something here, then I think we got to go back and evaluate. All right, what did we miss? And then make sure that the next time we're doing it better. So with the Heather Hill detention, for instance, one of the ideas that I had, and I communicated to the village manager, was I will go and stand in line at the pickup line at the schools and hand out a flyer if that helps, right? So there's already things we could use the PTO, and there's numerous associations that we could tap into to say, hey, here's what we're trying to communicate. How can we communicate this better, and what can we do more? And I think a lot of that thought process after that was carried into the way the communication is going for the downtown revitalization program. And there's been focus groups and communication, and the communication's been earlier. And when the question has come up, is it too early to communicate? My answer has always been no. Communicate now, and then we can communicate again, and then we can communicate it again. But just having the engagement of all of the people who are involved, listening to what they have to say. And one of those things with the businesses in that particular situation is, how is this going to impact you? So we can listen, and then we can go back and say, okay, you told us this is how it's going to impact you. Here's what we can do as a village to help. And then here's also our limitations. So let's see what we can work out with this. But it also gives us the ability to direct the people who will be doing the work. Hey, make sure that you're taking care of these things for these businesses. So I think a lot of it is doing as much listening as we can on the front end, then evaluating how our communication went and applying those lessons to the next time.
Okay, so there's already some progress with
Yeah.
taking lessons from the basin and applying them to the next project.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. The basin and the downtown project, both big infrastructure projects, and there are more. There have been street projects, bridge projects.
Yeah.
So infrastructure is a big issue for the village. It's very expensive. I know
Yes.
you pay close attention to it
Yes.
from what you've said on the board at
Yeah.
board meetings. The one that I think is interesting is balancing streets and flood mitigation,
Right.
which, how do you see going forward? I mean, it seems like that we're kind of have made a lot of inroads in funding from
Right.
grants,
Yes.
which takes the pressure off the village funding.
Yeah.
But now when the grants are spent, how are we going to go forward? Because there's
Yeah.
still a lot of need out there. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And from, I've been a home inspector and property inspector for 13 years. So I understand, like, there's maintenance that has to happen. If that maintenance doesn't happen, then it's going to end up costing you more in the long run. So I think it's on a couple of fronts. I'm glad you mentioned the grants, because we have a team in Flossmoor with John Brunke and the village manager, assistant village manager, and Avoa in the finance department, who are amazing at going after grants. We've had, I don't have all the numbers in front of me, but millions of dollars have come in from grants that we would not have otherwise had. So that grant money is huge. I think that's a big first step. I think maintenance and prioritizing is really important. So one of the things we were able to do was, in this last year, we made some decisions about, let's defer a little bit of replacement of roads so that we can do some sealing and repair of roads, which we can get more coverage on that. And what that does is that it will allow those roads to stay in better condition for longer, so we can do more roads in the long run. Because if they're not going to go bad for 3 or 4 years later, then we don't have to spend money on, we can do more. So I think maintenance is important. There's a lot of subgrade work that has to happen. Our infrastructure, much of it was from the 1930s to the 1960s. And with the exception of a handful of neighborhoods, it's really old and hasn't been touched for a long time. So yeah, that's one of the things that's really critical. And then, that goes hand in hand with developing more economic development, new businesses, new tax revenue, new, all of that goes into it as well. But it's a pretty big, that's honestly, other than the services that we offer the residents, the maintenance of the village is just a massive undertaking.
I'm glad you mentioned the tax burden and the role that economic development plays. The village has put more emphasis on attracting new businesses in recent years. Are you? What's your take on the strategy so far? Retail Coach, for instance, was a consultant hired to bring in businesses.
Yeah.
How's that going?
I like the process that we've chosen to take, and a lot of that comes from having had conversations with the community and people when I was running or when I first got on the board about, like, hey, yeah, economic development is important, but what should it look like? Because what we don't want is a bunch of tire shops and mattress stores and things like that it's not right for our community. So it is a little bit longer period of time that it's going to take to get the right businesses. But I think connecting with someone like the Retail Coach has helped us tremendously, because we just don't have the resources in shop to go after these big national companies. And we can do some things, but these guys have relationships with them constantly. They've got a proven track record. So we definitely have some things coming up that are exciting, things that I can't talk too much detail about, but we will be doing some presentations, I'm sure, soon. But yeah, we've made a lot of growth, and a lot of interest has come in, and they have a very entailed approach about how they go about it. So using that expertise, sometimes we have to spend some money to save money, and sometimes we have to spend money to make money. And that's one of those things that I think unanimously the board through this entire process has felt really good about that setup.
Yeah. And that is, like you say, an investment that is for a long
Yep.
term. It takes a while to get each project going, and its impact on the property tax
Yeah.
bill is going to be in the future too, because
Yes.
the businesses have to get up and get going.
Yep.
I know that property taxes really hurt right now, especially since last summer when the rates spiked, and we got alarming bills. And the village's role or portion of that is pretty small, so
Very
your
small.
ability to impact it is limited.
Right.
But I wondered if you had ideas about what else the village could do to impact the whole system in terms of advocacy, maybe.
Yeah, so I think a lot of that is being done not just with our village, but in conjunction with others. So one of the things that the mayor and the village manager has done, which I fully support, is working with other local communities to put pressure on the state of Illinois, even to get some of the tax revenue that they've originally promised at the full level. Because when we don't have that, that just kind of messes things up. So working together with other towns and other villages and other leaders to say, okay, let's go to the state, let's pull those resources, and let's really go after getting what we feel like we need and deserve. I think that's one big component of it. And I think another is our portion is very small compared to the overall. And I think it's sometimes people don't even understand that the village of Flossmoor is completely separate in our governing and management than the school district. And the school district is a large chunk, and we have a world-class school. I'd put it up against any other in the state of Illinois, but it comes at a cost. So I do think that what we can do as the village is really drive and push the economic development so that the residents' portion is a smaller portion of that pie. And that's what we're working towards. So that's why the economic development portion is so important. And I think having the vacant land that we've done that very intelligently, which was all done before I was here. We are still doing some no cash bid properties. Some have come through even this year or last year. But I think that's what we got to do. We just got to really push and then spend wisely. Make sure that we're using the money that the taxes are being given to us, that we're using it in a way that's responsible so that we're saving money along the way.
Okay, and bringing businesses in is important and helps the village, but we also have existing businesses, and in Flossmoor, most of them are relatively small.
Yep.
In downtown and in Flossmoor Commons mainly.
Yeah.
And I've heard some of them say that it's difficult to keep going. We've seen
Right.
some turnover in both business districts. I know you've done some work in social media to promote local businesses,
Yeah.
and I was wondering what you thought the village's role could be in providing support to improve their longevity.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's twofold. First off, and this is something that I've said, and I've been a resounding gong on this consistently with anyone who will listen inside the village, and they all do. We have to be the easiest to do business with. So our small business owners have to feel like they can approach us at any time with a concern, with an idea, with requests for help. We've got to be approachable. And I think that goes past just the village management. I think, myself as a trustee, I have a responsibility to go in and ask and see how it's going, which I do. I visit each of those stores at least annually, most of them quarterly. So whether it's Gypsy Fix or whether it's Rita at Therapy or the conservatory, I'm going in and saying, hey, how are things going? How is this affecting you? How are you feeling about these things? I take that information that I get from them, and then I take it back to the village and say, hey, here's what's going on. One of the big conversations I had was after we didn't do Flossmoor Fest. I went and talked to every business that I could and said, how is this affecting you? How did the last one go? and how is not having it what are your concerns? So I was able to take that and go back and say, hey, okay, guys, here's what I'm hearing. Here's what I'm being told from the small business owners. And I think that's for all the businesses we have, whether it's in Flossmoor Commons or down on Sterling. Small business is hard. And through COVID, the community did a fantastic job of supporting the local businesses. I mean, there was a groundswell of support. And that started to fade off a little bit. And I get it. Amazon's easy. Mail order is really easy. So one of the things that I also try and do is make sure there's awareness of what we have in the village. And I think the village can do that as well by highlighting these small businesses that we have. So even something like do a monthly small business highlight, similar to what I'm doing, but the village, I think, has more reach. And just highlighting each of those businesses, going through every single one of them, putting our staff that we have that can behind that, and just using the reach that the village has to get that out as well.
Okay. What did you hear about Flossmoor Fest? Because that was a big item of conversation last fall.
It's interesting because, and I won't name businesses because that was private conversation, but for some of them, Flossmoor Fest was fantastic. It was one of their biggest years. For others, they were break even or lose a little bit. And it was more of a hassle sometimes, but they got it. They understood, I'm supporting this because this supports the downtown. And sometimes the one event helps bring people back week after week after week. So I think a lot of the things that came up in the conversations that I had was, how can we make it more equitable and even for all of the businesses? And some of that is where our barricades start, right? If a barricade's here, then it's hard for this particular business, or points of entry, or how are we dividing out the sidewalk and the traffic? I think it was conversations like that, or the hours. When is this running, and what kind of promotion of the times? And so I think a lot of it was different for each business, which is always the difficult thing because all those businesses are so different. But I think that's where we just got to listen and say, okay, what are the common things that we can help with? And then what are some things that maybe we can advise them? Here's some things that we think you can do. Because we have brilliant people in our village. I mean, you look at our village, look at any profession, we've got someone at the top of that. And I think those people are more than willing to help in a lot of those situations.
Yeah, there is a lot of talent, and like you said, the listening helps you even get down into the fine details to craft the events so that they work for everybody. Yeah. That's the last thing I wanted to ask you about is whether you want to have the last word, and we've covered a lot of ground, but there's other issues that you may have as high priorities for you that we haven't talked about. So
yeah, absolutely. I do, and I think some of those are topics that I feel like are really important to the community and things that have been discussed over the last couple of years. And the 4 years that I've been a trustee, it hasn't been an easy 4 years for the village and for the community. The community has had some tragic events happen and some very difficult decisions that had to be made that affected the community. And, the most recent has been the firing of Jarrell Jones. And, I in that situation, I understand that has an outsized impact on 63% of our community. And that's because we are a predominantly African-American community, and that's a tough hit. So for me, going through that whole process, my way of going about making the decisions that I made was, it started, like we've talked about, with the communication. So through that whole process, anyone who had a question or a concern or reached out to me or came and said something at a board meeting that I felt like I need to talk to them, I reached out to them, and I had probably a dozen sit-down conversations with people who were there to talk about their concerns. And I had other conversations outside of that with neighbors and people that I like, hey, what's your perspective on this? Because I have to always check myself and make sure that my perspective is not just my perspective, because I'm not here just to represent what I think. So through that whole process, I had hopes up until even close to the end that we would find a path forward, and it's not the way that it went. And ultimately, I had to make a decision that I felt like, what is best for Flossmoor moving forward? And that's the decision that I came to. And, when we first sat down with the state, the people that were helping us with our original finding of the candidates to hire, they asked us, what's important to you in a candidate? And my number one thing was, they absolutely have to be able to do the job. They got to be qualified to do the job. And I know you're going to bring people who are qualified to do the job. So my second thing is, if all things are equal, what our community needs is a minority candidate who can do the job, who's going to be in there, because when you look at the makeup of our staff, it doesn't reflect the community. And that was extremely important to me, and still is, that the police chief is a minority, because there's also the whole feeling with police and the public in this country is in a really bad spot. And I felt like that is what we need as a community. So that was what I said then. It's what I say now. It's what I believe moving forward. And I think not just in that situation, but our staff in general, which, we were able to bring on a full-time person who is directly under the director of building and code, who is a minority, which also is going to help because there's a bit of a succession plan there. And when that gets to a point, now we have more balance. So I think having the right voices at the table who are actually empowered to contribute is really, really important. And I was very disappointed. I like Jarrell. I think he's a good man. I like his family. I did 2 home inspections for him when he was looking for a house, and had conversations with him before almost every board meeting about how things are going. And I wish him nothing but the best. I'm glad he landed in a spot where he didn't have to move his family, and I hope he has a fantastic career, and have actually had the opportunity to communicate that to him directly. But I think what it comes down to, even in that situation, which is we've been talking about communication, I think we have to make sure that when there's things that we can say, we're saying them. I think there's sometimes a desire to be careful and not give too much and be respectful. But I think when the community is asking for information, we have to do our best to give as much of that information as we can so they understand where we're coming from. My decisions, every decision I make when I sit up there and I make a vote is, what do I believe is best for the village? And then I need to be able to justify that. So even today, if anybody has questions, I would be more than willing to go more in depth in that situation or any other about why I voted the way that I did. But just know that it's because I believe that's what's best for the community as a whole.
Thank you. That is a difficult situation that the whole community wrestled with. Yeah. And people still talk about that it seemed to introduce a divide that people hadn't felt previously.
Right.
And I wonder if you might briefly address how to heal that divide.
Honestly, I think healing the divide takes some understanding. Yeah. And part of that understanding is understanding where people are coming from. And we may not be able to understand it completely, but when it comes to the race issue, typically with Caucasians or white people, when we're talking about race, it's an issue of comfort. The worst that can happen is I can be called a racist, typically. But for minorities, when we talk about race, it's coming from a place of safety. Those are 2 very different things. So even when someone is coming and talking to me about something, I have to try and identify they're coming at me from a position of safety concern. And that takes a different type of listening. And it takes a lot less talking, honestly, and more listening, because I'm never going to understand what it's like to be them. I've got a son who comes home from Dunning's every night at 8 o'clock after his shift, and I'm concerned for him because he's a minority, but I don't know what it's like. I have a level of comfort in this country that others just aren't afforded. So I think anytime we have a racially, charged isn't the right word, anytime we have an issue where race is at the center of it, I think it's really important that the conversations that we have are honest. We do as much listening as we possibly can and understand that I don't understand. And if I take that in, then my listening changes. And so that's what I've tried to do in this. And that's what a lot of the conversations that I've had with people, whether it was that or with the Madeline Miller situation, where I also had numerous conversations with people who were coming to protest and speak out about that. That's how I try and approach it. And I think that's the responsible thing to do. I think it's how I was raised. You got to know someone before you comment on their actions. So that's how I'm trying to approach all these situations. I'm not always perfect with it. And we may disagree with my decision in the end, but we can talk about that as well. So that's my approach with it. And I think if we can do that generally, as a village and as a community, I think that's where a lot of growth happens. there's just not enough open dialogue and conversation about it, I think.